My very first guest, Peter Jennings, served as an advisor to Prime Minister John Howard and was later the Deputy Secretary for Policy and Strategy in the Department of Defence. Subsequently, as the Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, he is regarded as one of this nation's most respected experts on defence policy and national security. I had the pleasure of working with him both in the Defence Department and at ASPI later on, and his insights into grand strategy and the longer-term implications of the collapse of Afghanistan are absolutely invaluable. Peter Jennings, welcome to the McGregor Angle. Thanks for making time for us.
My pleasure, Catherine. Thanks for your kind introduction.
Peter, when Australia joined the coalition to destroy Al-Qaeda's training camps way back in October 2001, and we were mates and colleagues in that era, did you ever imagine that Australia would still have troops serving in that nation 2 decades later?
No, absolutely not. I mean, the first thing to say is no one imagined we would be sending forces to Afghanistan before September of 2001. And I don't think anyone imagined that they would be there for almost for 20 years. It goes to the immense challenges that are involved, not simply in being able to attack a target, to use a bomb to kill an identified collection of terrorists, but the real challenge was, what did you do with Afghanistan? How did you try to stabilise that country to make sure that it could never again become a haven for terrorist extremists? And I think that was the challenge that the United States and allied countries faced. Was we really didn't have a clear idea about how to do that. It's one thing to fight an enemy. It's entirely another thing to try to build a society to make it possible for you to then withdraw your forces.
And again, we're not into too much mutual back scratching, but I think both of us started to question the wisdom of nation building and counterinsurgency a long time ago. And I might add, when there's a lot of fingers being pointed and blame going around at the moment, you argued very persuasively that the timetable outlined by President Biden was inviting the very type of capitulation we've seen. You wrote a very persuasive piece on 20 April, which has held its age pretty well. Tell our audience exactly why you thought it was a folly to telegraph that withdrawal punch in the manner that he did.
Well, my concern was simply that this was happening in the middle of what's called fighting season in Afghanistan. Joe Biden did not look to have developed a thought-through policy shared by the rest of the American national security community about how to do this. He just had an emotional view that what was needed was that American forces had to get out as quickly as possible. Now, for the last 18 months or so, Catherine, what the US had in Kabul was a force of around 2,500 soldiers. They had not taken a casualty for about 18 months. So in other words, at relatively low cost, the US was stabilising the situation in Afghanistan in ways which were keeping a democratic government elected in Kabul, denying Kabul to America's enemies, be they China or the Taliban, and ensuring that no attack from Afghan soil was actually coming forward to present to either the United States or Europe or Australia. On the face of it, you could say not such a bad situation. What Joe Biden did was to simply remove all of those foundations and do them pretty much overnight. Take away the air power, which was the key thing supporting the Afghan military, which is largely a ground force. Completely pull the confidence rug out from under the Afghan political leadership. And therefore, we should hardly be surprised at that point that all of a sudden we find Afghanistan's towns and then ultimately Kabul being overrun. I always thought the risk, Catherine, was that we would have something a little bit like the experience of the Iraqi army in Iraq when the Islamic State was running rampant through the north and west of the country a couple of years ago. Your average conscript soldier simply concluded, well, if the generals aren't prepared to fight the war and the politicians aren't, maybe I'll just take off my uniform and run away. And largely that seems to have been what happened in Afghanistan. Can I say it didn't have to be that way? Even if you accept the principle that a withdrawal was what America needed to do, Biden could have chosen to do that over a series of years, building more capability inside the Afghan special forces, giving them air capability to protect the ground forces, instead of which it was a cut and run, a chase for the saloon door. And we really shouldn't be surprised that it ended in the disastrous way that it did.
Indeed, and when one considers what the Washington Post revealed back in 2019 in its so-called Afghan papers, there were already ominous warnings that widespread corruption was leading to the padding of payrolls in some of their conventional units. As you've pointed out, their special forces gave a good account of themselves most of the time, but a large part of the army appears to have existed only on paper, and corrupt officers were either not paying their troops or else padding out the nominal roles of their units. So it was a bit of a paper tiger in the end, and its capitulation, as you said, they didn't have as much skin in the game as the Taliban. So that mustn't have been entirely surprising to you.
Well, the Iraqi story was exactly the same during the high point of IS's successes. I think there was also a mistake in terms of a US thinking about the type of military it was trying to create in Afghanistan. It was wanting the Afghan military to use American weapons systems, which are usually complicated and high maintenance. The Afghan army was not defeated by by high technology from the Taliban. The Taliban was using, RPG-launched rockets. It was using AK-47s and Toyota pickups. So had there been an attempt to sort of design an Afghan military around the capabilities and the experiences of Afghan fighters, I think there could have been, more success on the ground, absent the issue of psychological defeat, which I think was the thing that ultimately just took all the fight out of the Afghan military. What's interesting now, Catherine, is that we're seeing opposition forces to the Taliban are already beginning to gather in one of the northern provinces, led by the son of one of the old opponents of the Taliban from a generation ago. And how will they fight? They'll fight. Yeah, they'll fight with basic weapons. They'll fight with pickup vehicles. They won't fight at all like the Americans. So, we were trying to design an Afghan military that was not suited for the Afghan people, and I think that became one of the ultimate mistakes in the last few years of the conflict.
And a very costly one it's turned out to be as well. But Peter, looking at the longer term implications now, and it's way too early to tell whether Taliban 2.0 will perhaps be less receptive to accommodating global jihadist movements. My sense is that they've been bloodied and they will settle for governing Afghanistan under Sharia law and probably not be as receptive, although the Haqqani network is intact on the other side of the Pakistan border. But is US resolve irretrievably damaged by this? Theresa May, for instance, in the House of Commons, asked a searing question of Boris Johnson yesterday, more or less saying, are we able to trust NATO and the United States going forward? Do you think this is this a hinge of history moment we're seeing here, or can the US reconstitute to face the global challenge of a rising China?
I think it's a mistake to always write off the United States, but they sure have had a massive blow, I think, in terms of their own confidence. It's been interesting looking at Biden's cabinet, Catherine, just to see how shocked they are and reaching for facts that they cannot explain about what has happened in Kabul. Clearly, this is no way for the United States to try and say to the rest of the world, well, we're back and you can trust us and we will always work with the allies. Equally, though, I think a message is something that the allies need to take on board themselves, and that is to say it's not just about our confidence in America, it needs to be about America's confidence in us. In Australia, we've been fooling ourselves for way too long now that spending 2% of gross national product on defence and having a defence force which is about 2/3 the size of a decent MCG crowd, that's enough for Australia. We don't need to do any more. To the extent that that's ever been true, it's been true because of the United States. And clearly the message from this week is that America wants more of its allies to be able to look after our own interests. So that means us, the Japanese, the British, the consequential allied partners of the United States will have to do more. And we need to force the Americans to be better allies in their own right. We need to give them the confidence to say that we and them can work to protect the interests of the democracies in our part of the world. I'm not sure if Joe Biden is really going to be capable of that, Catherine. I think this is going to come as a major shock to his own confidence and certainly to his cabinet. But really, now that we're in this situation, the point is, how do we try to walk out from that as the collective democracies of the world together and to be stronger? I think that's the challenge that we face from here on.
And there's been some good work done, of course, on the Quad already, and your team at ASPI has led the charge with Marcus Hellier and Michael Shoebridge looking at the force structure. Just to round this out, Peter, an implication, as we've got to shoulder the burden, do you think we've configured our force badly or inappropriately over these last 2 decades? And I've got to accept culpability too, having been part of the hardening of the army, so-called. I think every cent we're spending on new armoured fighting vehicles should be spent on missiles. That's my own view, and I've had this discussion with Jim Molan. I know the ASPI views that. Round us out on whether you think we need to reconfigure pretty rapidly for potential operations in our air and sea approaches. Are we too ground-centric after 20 years of COIN?
Well, it's a good question. I certainly reflect on the fact that almost all of my senior time as an official in the Defence Department was absorbed by the conflicts that we were fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. Yes, there was stabilisation missions in Timor and the Solomon Islands, but primarily that was the driving operational focus of the day. I think a second problem has been that there's been an overinvestment of effort in thinking about the structure of the Defence Force that we plan to have sometime in the late 2030s and 2040s. And you can afford to do that in an environment which is at peace. A world of, the Asian Century white paper that Julia Gillard wrote, which saw nothing but opportunity in Asia. Now we know, of course, that we face a dire strategic situation in the Indo-Pacific region driven by a more aggressive China. And the truth of the matter is that the Defence Force is not structured for that reality, for the reality of 2021, 2022. And it's going to change, it's going to require a real change of mindset, I think, Catherine, to get the Defence Organisation understanding that what matters now is how do we strengthen the Defence Force for next year and the year after that, not simply for the late 2030s and 2040s. And that means we have to change how we design the equipment that we need, how we acquire it, how we put it into service. We're going to have to get much more innovative, more lateral thinking, faster. We're going to have to spend more on defence, even though governments don't want to do that. And we're going to have to do it at a pace that we've not been used to doing for decades.
Well, Peter, on that very sombre note, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you for joining the McGregor Angle. Have a safe weekend, and we'll talk again as this unfolds. This story's got a way to run yet. Peter Jennings, thank you.
Thanks so much, Catherine. It's a pleasure.